From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. October 11, 1999 Observer Newsletter. Vince Russo leaves WWF for WCW. By Dave Meltzer. Vince Russo and Ed Ferreira, the men who were responsible for writing the WWF television shows that have been drawing huge ratings for the past year, abruptly quit the company and signed on with WCW over the weekend. Russo in various interviews cited the burnout factor of working so many hours with the added stress of the SmackDown show as the main component of his approaching WCW, first through J.J. Dillon, and then closing the 2-year deal after lengthy meetings with Bill Bush on October 2nd, signing the contract in Atlanta the next morning. He stated on WrestleLine that he was drained from being on call 24 hours a day for nearly 3 years and that he needed to spend more time with his family. The move is being lauded as the best possible move for WCW, because they have writers with proven track records in the world of pro wrestling. Russo and Ferreira were responsible for a lot of conceptual changes within the WWF, including less emphasis on in the ring, increased soap opera with an emphasis on raunchiness and basically aiming the product at teenage boys, a strategy that ended up being a huge hit among not only teenage boys, but younger kids and males in their 20s. How they'll fit into the Turner system, which just days earlier nixed the relatively tame in comparison to WWF standards, Lenny and Lodi tag team, because of a decree from the standards and practices, becomes a big question. In addition, WCW skews much older in its demographics, partially because of its older faces on top, although even among the older demographics WWF had surpassed WCW. Russo's official title will be the creative supervisor, and he's been given full authority on all matters when it comes to creativity and booking. Exactly what this will mean isn't clear. Russo and Ferreira start officially with the company on October 11th, but since the plans for Halloween Havoc are already laid out, no changes are expected until after the next pay-per-view. Russo is in a unique position to cement his reputation. He was the key writer in the turnaround of Raw, which fueled all other aspects of business, which took the WWF from the verge of bankruptcy and averaging a 2.4 rating for Raw in 1997, to where the rating has hovered at better than a 6.0 average for the same show the past few months, and fallout the company's a $56 million profit last year and expected windfall from the IPO. Raw has become, on a consistent basis, the top-rated show on cable television except for NFL games. He's going to a company which in recent months has seen the bottom drop out. Hal's show business is weak, but still shows signs of a pulse, at least on Monday nights. Pay-per-view business is unbelievably weak, as the most recent Fall Brawl show headlined by Hogan vs. Sting did in the 0.3 range, making it the lowest buy rate in the history of the industry for a WWF or WCW pay-per-view show. TV ratings are still falling despite the show quality improving over recent weeks. Russo is big on skits and soap operas, two qualities that WCW has been sorely lacking and clearly needs. He's not big on work rate or athletics, which, as ratings show, are not what draws fans to the shows anymore, although many feel when the current fad burns out, ring work will become more important, as cyclical patterns of past wrestling history seems to indicate. Nobody knows where anyone fits in, but Hulk Hogan is clearly nervous, since recent figures show he's no longer a draw and he's earning Steve Austin-like money from a deal put together at a time when he was still the box office king of the industry. There's no question the company needs to push younger talent, but the only wrestlers in the company Russo has had major dealings with in the recent past are Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Bret Hart. The company had already decreed that Bill Goldberg was going to be pushed ahead of Hogan as the top star, with a series of scenarios set to climax with Goldberg getting the title from Hart at Starrcade, leaving potential title defenses against Nash, Hall, Hogan and Sting on the table for 2000. But for now, all bets are off. Russo and Ferreira, who were both working without contracts with the WWF, which was a stunning oversight, apparently because Vince McMahon was of the belief they weren't a threat to leave, despite many people suggesting to WCW that they hire Russo to write television. They were apparently looking for some sort of security in their position, although Russo claimed it was not a money deal and that he's only making slightly more in WCW. Apparently McMahon told him he'd get back with them and then came back with a different answer than they were hoping for. Russo, who had known Dillon from Dillon's days in the WWF, called him to set up dialogue with Bush. Bush flew him in on October 2nd, the next day, and after 10 hours of negotiations, they put the deal together. Russo called McMahon, who was returning from the England pay-per-view, the next night, and the WWF broke the news on its website about 10 minutes later. Even to people high up in both company, the news about Russo, ironically, there were people who before this time did have an inkling about Ferrara. When it broke on Sunday, came as a total shock to just about everyone. WCW actually announced the hiring on television during Nitro. If nothing else, this maneuver will probably answer the question as to who is really responsible for the success of the Raw show. Russo and Ferrara came up with many of the ideas, but McMahon was still the final editor, tweaking ideas and throwing out ones he didn't think would work. Russo joined the WWF in 1992 as a writer for the magazine after owning a video store and getting involved in pro wrestling as the sponsor of a wrestling radio show headed by John Arezzi. In the midst of the WWF steroids scandal, Arezzi's show was most vehement on the subject, and Russo and Arezzi had a falling out at the same time Russo made the decision to join the WWF. Russo was invited to booking meetings and impressed Vince McMahon, who started using some of his ideas, and eventually he became McMahon's top creative force, although he made enemies of a lot of wrestling traditionalists along the way because he was very brash and opinionated, and some said he had a myopic viewpoint of pro wrestling. But he was writing the show when the show went through the roof, and there is no question the raunchiness was a prime part of the formula. That formula is handcuffed in the Turner regime, as was the emphasis on soap opera over athletics. His style of television, as exemplified on Raw, is short television matches, one saying that no wrestling match on television should be longer than 7 minutes, and often without even coming up with finishes. The famous sports entertainment finish where everyone simply walks to the back for no reason, or the easy plethora run-in DQ finishes. He's also said he believes that no Japanese or Mexican wrestler could ever get over with mainstream fans in the United States. His detractors in the company have said he was lost in booking anything from bell to bell or in coming up with finishes. While WCW's popularity fell every time they got too heavy on the non-finishes and ran very short matches, WWF's television ratings went through the roof with the same concepts. WCW was just getting the emphasis back on clean winners and losers, as the October 4th Nitro featured pinfalls in every match, including in one case DDP versus Bagwell, a heel beating a relatively strong face clean without outside interference using his move. And it was also probably the strongest pure wrestling episode of a WCW television show in months, with Benoit versus Hart, Kidman versus Guerrera, and Mysterio Jr. versus Malenko all on the same show. But the ratings spoke a different language once again, showing how difficult it is to reverse the direction of a snowball rolling down a hill. Wrestling throughout the world, despite the media not recognizing this, is in a decline due to the lack of creating new superheroes, with the existing ones getting stale and having no fresh foes. The WWF is the only company that has remained consistently strong. Ferrara joined the WWF a few years later as a former comedy writer with experience on the cartoon series Duckman on the USA Network. He had some experience in wrestling, growing up as a fan and even attending the Only Slammers wrestling school, where he wrestled under the name Beautiful Bruce Bodine, and once did an angle on WWF television as a fan mocking Jim Ross Bell's palsy that was dropped on his head by Steve Williams. WWF Entertainment filed a breach of contract lawsuit on October 1st against Martha Hart and the estate of Owen Hart, asking for a dismissal of Hart's wrongful death lawsuit against the company, damages in excess of $75,000 plus lawyers' fees for a breach of contract, and at worst a change of venue of the Hart lawsuit to Connecticut. It was a week with a lot of different developments as it regarded the death of Owen Hart back on May 23rd in Kansas City, with WCW running Nitro in the same Kemper Arena where Hart fell to his death when a stunt where he'd rappel from more than 70 feet above the ring went awry on a live pay-per-view event. Bret Hart weeks ago asked company management if he could have a singles match against Chris Benoit on the show as something of a tribute to his late brother, and in addition, the final touches were being put on for an A&E biography on Owen Hart. The WWFE's grounds for the lawsuit are based on Owen Hart's signed contract of July 1, 1996, which requires that any and all claims, disputes, or other matters in question that arise from or relate to the contract have to be adjudicated in Connecticut. Pamela Fisher, one of Hart's attorneys, responded by the asking for a change of venue due to that contract stipulation by saying, "It also says in the contract that the contract expires upon death. We treat it as null and void because it expired upon his death and he's obviously dead." In attempting to get the case dismissed outright, the WWFE noted that Hart expressly assumed the risks of harm and of physical injury within his contract, which stated, "Owen Hart acknowledges that the participation and activities required by Owen Hart, in connection with his performance in a professional wrestling exhibition may be dangerous and may involve the risk of serious bodily injury. Owen Hart knowingly and freely assumes full responsibility for all such inherent risks, as well as those due to the negligence of WWF, other wrestlers, or otherwise. Another clause in the same contract stated, Owen Hart hereby releases, waives and discharges WWF from all liability to Owen Hart, and covenants not to sue WWF for any and all loss or damage on account of injury to the person or property or resulting in serious injury to Owen Hart or in Owen Hart's death, whether caused by the negligence of WWF, other wrestlers or otherwise. The contract with Hart also stated, in regard to the asking for punitive damages by Martha Hart, that in no circumstances whatsoever shall either party to this agreement be liable to the other party for any punitive or exemplary damages, and all such damages, whether arising out of the breach of this agreement, or otherwise, are expressly waived. Hart signed a contract in 1996 calling for a $250,000 per year downside guarantee, and was given a raise to $400,000 per year to return to the company after he had walked out in November 1997 in the wake of the famous match involving his brother and Shawn Michaels in Montreal. The legal question is that whether the contract signed by Owen Hart applies, after death, to Martha Hart. Titan continued to send Martha Hart paychecks on Owen's contract for approximately 14 weeks after his death, apparently to show that the contract was still valid and applied to her. Martha Hart returned all the checks uncashed, apparently trying to show that it didn't, because they believe Owen's contract would be legally binding to Martha. The filing of the lawsuit constitutes a breach of contract, and those are the grounds they are asking for $75,000 damages plus all attorney fees regarding this case. The WWF is in addition asking for a change of venue because none of the plaintiffs in the case, in specific, Martha, her children Athena, Uya and Owen's parents Stu and Helen, have any connection to the state of Missouri, but claim many of the people involved have a connection to Connecticut, the site of the WWF headquarters, the site where Hart's contract was executed and the place where his paychecks came from. Even if a change in venue is granted, and that seems unlikely because the accident itself took place in Missouri, the trial would be governed under the laws of Missouri because that's where the alleged acts of negligence took place. It is generally believed that a jury in Connecticut would be more favorable to the WWF than a jury in Missouri. At one point there were plans for city officials in Kansas City to honor Stu Hart at the show, and for a more elaborate ceremony, but Bret Hart nixed those plans feeling he didn't want anything to publicly come off as exploitative. WCW in its booking meeting where the match was finalized, was very careful going through how it would be handled because they also knew plans to honor would be criticized as being exploitative. It was also believed by many that when WWF held its first SmackDown tapings on August 24 in the same building, that by never once mentioning Hart on the show, despite it being the most emotional aspect backstage of that show, they were avoiding the issue because the death was the most publicized wrestling news event in the US in modern times. WCW re-aired the video Mike Tenay put together for Bret Hart's return on July 6 at the Georgia Dome early in the show and pushed the match throughout. Harley Race was brought in as special ring announcer for the match, which was partially to tell the story since they wanted to do a Harley Race-style NWA World title match. Originally, they were to enter the ring without any entrance music to almost give the match a sense of being a throwback to that era of wrestling that Owen Hart grew up with, although that decision was changed during the afternoon. Benoit did an out-of-character interview talking about Owen Hart. While Bret Hart didn't do an interview at his own request, he actually did change his mind later in the day, but the show had already been booked out by that point. The match itself was the longest match in the history of Nitro, going 27:33 before Hart won with the sharpshooter. It was a very good old-style match, reminiscent of a lengthy scientific classic along the lines of a Dory Funk vs. Jack Briscoe style match. The fans were very respectful to it early with a slow build, which is totally against today's style of television wrestling, but were into the intensity as the match built. Although the match was clearly a success to the live crowd, it was also sad in another sense because it was made clear that this was a special situation and aberration where the crowd, probably the majority of whom were in the building the night Owen died, weren't about to yell boring or show any disrespect for either wrestler without the immediate gratification today's wrestling fans want. In many ways, it almost came off like the closing of a chapter of a book and the end of the wrestling style that both men grew up with in Stampede Wrestling but was the classic style of NWA World title matches during the 70s and 80s. Hart and Benoit looked at the sky after the match and both hugged each other and were teary-eyed at the finish. And were also hugged by Race, the former record-holding 8-time NWA champion, billed as the greatest wrestler in the history of Kansas City, with Tony Schiavone calling it a great Nitro moment. Mike Tenay and Shivani did a superlative job of calling the match in a non-hype pro wrestling fashion, but Bobby Heenan's refusal to break character was very much out of place. It also came across, whether it was designed to or not, as a major slight when Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair came out for an interview following the match, and while acknowledging race being there, never made mention of what preceded them on the show. It should also be noted that when Hart suggested this match to the booking committee, he asked for a 25 minutes match, asked for no outside interference, and that his current angle involving Lex Luger not be a part of the match in any form, and asked that Benoit win. The booking committee thinks Hart is being groomed for a big push, although with the new bookers, all bets are off, but Hart vs. Sting for the title was scheduled to headline the November 21st WCW Mayhem pay-per-view from Toronto, and at some point soon Hart was being groomed for a title reign, and because they felt under the circumstances of the match for the fans in that city, Hart needed to win the match. My own feeling on this ahead of time is that had it been done properly, Benoit winning would have been the best possible finish, and I guess we'll never know for sure, but I wasn't as sure of it as the match went on, sensing the way the crowd was reacting. In addition, High Road Productions, the same Toronto-based company that produced Wrestling with Shadows, was putting the finishing touches on a 1-hour A&E biography show on Owen Hart, which will air on November 17th in the United States. It will air first in Canada on November 3rd. The World Wrestling Federation's United Kingdom-only pay-per-view event on October 2nd was produced more like an American pay-per-view show as opposed to the previous shows, which were more along the lines of loaded house shows. The show drew a sellout 11,939, paying $467,494 at the National Indoor Arena in Birmingham, England, and was said to be a strong show, well above the level of the recent domestic WWF pay-per-view shows. Thanks to Dan Reed and Jonathan Browning for this report. The show opened with a dark match as Christian, Jay Russo, pinned Crash Holly, Aaron O'Grady, in 439 with a roll-up. 1.25 stars. The show opened with Jeff Jarrett issuing a challenge to any woman in the audience, saying he'd give them £1,000, that's British currency, and not that he'd give them viscera as a present, if they would vacuum up crumbs from the middle of the ring. A plant came out and Jarrett put her in the figure 4. Chyna then did a run-in and clotheslined Jarrett out of the ring. 1. In the opener, Jarrett pinned D'Lo Brown, Oxy Connor, in 6:12 to retain the IC title. They had a coin flip before the match to determine whether the IC title or the European title would be at stake. Jarrett lost the coin flip, meaning his belt would be the one on the line. It sure makes a lot of sense to have a European title belt, and then on the rare occasion you actually have a show in Europe, it's not defended. Jarrett won after hitting Brown with a vacuum cleaner in a match described as being similar to their SummerSlam match. He then challenged Chyna to a match later in the show. 2.25 stars. 2. Godfather Charles Wright pinned Gangrel David Heath in 6:19 with a pimp drop, aka the world's sloppiest looking Death Valley driver. Gangrel got a huge reaction since his look is apparently similar to a British punk look, and also looked good in carrying the match to well above the normal Godfather level. 1.25 stars. 3. Val Venus Sean Morley pinned Mark Henry in 3:47 with the money shot. Henry got surprisingly little offense. 1/4 star. Chyna did an interview, actually this was before the Venus match, accepting Jarrett's challenge. Davey Boy Smith came out and said that he wanted his promised WWF title match on this show against Triple H and would go to Vince McMahon. The advertised main event was Triple H defending the title in a cage match against Rock. At this point Smith was over huge as a babyface since he's from England. Smith was looking for McMahon, who told him that he had just gotten his title shot the previous Thursday on SmackDown and wasn't getting another one. Smith got so mad he threw a garbage can at Vince, who ducked, and the garbage can hit Stephanie. Actually, the camera shots made it clear the garbage can came nowhere close to hitting her, knocking her out. This played out with Vince furious at Bulldog and Stephanie being carried out of the building wearing a neck brace, but Bulldog refusing to apologize for the rest of the show. 4. In a four-way match for the WWF Women's title, Ivory, Lisa Moretti, retained the title over Jacqueline Moore, Tori, Terry Pock, and Luna, Gertrude Vachon Heath, in 6:51. This match was said to be better than you'd think. At one point they did a triple sleeper spot with Tori the final recipient, and she turned it into the triple jawbreaker spot. Ivory ended up pinning Jacqueline after hitting her with the title belt. 1/2 star. 5. Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, pinned Road Dogg Brian James in 11:58. This was said to have been the second best match on the show and had a lot of heat. Bulldog gave an interview while this was going on saying that it was an accident, and he didn't mean to hurt Stephanie, but didn't apologize for it either. Jim Ross and Michael Hayes, who did the announcing, were pushing that Jericho's cowardice was really all a front and that he was a dangerous man and a top wrestler. There was a ref bump and Curtis who's hit Dog with a chair to lead to the finish. 3.25 stars. 6. China beat Jarrett via DQ in what was apparently a non-title match in just 4:28 when Smith interfered and power slammed her. Jarrett put the figure 4 on China after the match 1/4 star. 7. Kane, Glenn Jacobs, pinned Big Show, Paul White in 8:38 of a no DQ match after hitting him with a chair. Said to be better than their previous pay-per-view matches. 3/4 star. 8. Smith pinned X-Pac, Sean Waltman, in 5:23 of a hot-paced match. Even at this point, the crowd was split 50-50. Smith won with a power slam and reports were that he looked better than he has in a long time. 2.25 stars. 9. Edge, Adam Copeland, and Christian beat Farouk, Ron Simmons, and Bradshaw, John Layfield, and Bob, Robert Howard, and Crash Holly in a three-way match in 8:42. The Hollies were announced as super heavyweights as a combined weight of 800 pounds. Let's see. When Jarrett talked, he used UK terminology in regard to currency, so shouldn't that be like a combined weight of 57 stone? Or maybe that's Jake Roberts. Actually, they did their own play on words where the Hardys couldn't figure out how stones in British terminology were equivalent to pounds in US, but pounds in Britain refers to money. Anyway, Bradshaw pinned Crash at 4:19 to eliminate the Hollies with the scary clothesline, and then Edge pinned Bradshaw to win the match after a tornado DDT. 2 stars. 10. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, retained the WWF title in a cage match over Rock, Dwayne Johnson, in 2033. Rock got the expected huge pop. There was a ton of interference in this match along with some juice. Actually, there was probably a ton of juice, but some blood is what I meant. At one point there was a ref bump and Rock got out the door first. That also allowed them to brawl outside the cage. At one point Rock put Triple H through a table. Triple H did a major league juice job after a chair shot. Rock came off the cage, not the top, this is the Rock, with an elbow drop sending Triple H through the announcer's table. Rock seemingly had the match won when Smith came out. Shane McMahon came out after Smith, but Smith body slammed him. Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe came out, but Smith beat them up as well. Rock was about to escape the cage but Chyna did the old shutting the cage door on his head routine from every WWF cage match in recent history. When that angle was first done in 1982 in Dallas, it resulted in 2.5 incredible years of business. At the end, Bulldog gave Rock a low blow and Chyna also attacked Rock. It wound up with Triple H leaving with Rock also trying to get out with Triple H winning the photo finish spot by climbing over the top. After the match, Vince came out and locked the door of the cage and gave Smith the finger, with Rock and Bulldog as the only two left inside. By this point Bulldog had turned full-fledged heel and Rock gave him the rock bottom and people's elbow to end the show on a happy note. 3.75 stars. As a comparison, this show was said to have been tons better than the No Mercy pay-per-view show from England or the recent Unforgiven, about even with the Capital Carnage pay-per-view but not in the same league as One Night Only, the original WWF UK pay-per-view show. They announced the next UK pay-per-view show for May 6, 2000 at Earl's Court in London. The lineup for the biggest martial arts event in the world, and without question the biggest combat sports event of the year in Japan, the K1 Grand Prix Championships on December 5 at the Tokyo Dome was finalized after the first round on October 3 before 32,800 fans at the Osaka Dome. The final 8 in a one-night tournament to crown the 7th annual K1 Grand Prix champion will include most, but not all of the top-rated K1 superstars. The field will be headed by three-time former champion, 1994, 1995, 1998 Peter Aerts, 1997 champion Ernesto Hoost, 1996 champion Andy Hoke and Sam Greco. They'll be joined by the returning Jerome Le Banner, regular Ray Sefo and a pair of surprises, Musashi from Japan and Mirko Filipovic, a boxer from Croatia who was the biggest surprise of the night. The tournament bracketing involving these 8 has yet to be announced. It will mark the third consecutive year the K1 finals have been held at the Tokyo Dome, which was a quick sellout on the first 2 occasions. The big disappointment was when the ratings came out as the show did a 13.3 rating, below what previous regular shows this season have done, and a 42% drop from the record 22.8 rating the first round of the Grand Prix drew last year. The first round bracketing for the Tokyo Dome will be Aerts vs. Le Banner, Hope vs. Hoost, Musashi vs. Filipovic and Sefo vs. Greco with the bracketing continuing in that order in the semifinals. which means the second half looks to be the easier half, as whomever gets out of the first side of the bracket should have two very tough matches. While if Filipovic's debut was any indication, he may get an easy first round match and a slightly tougher second round match, but either way it figures that whomever comes out of the lower bracket should be fresher going into the finals. Francisco Filho, who destroyed Hust earlier this year, missed Osaka, and thus is out of the running for the finals, due to an injury. Both Mike Bernardo and Masaaki Satake, perennial Final 8 competitors, suffered upset losses on this show. After the show, and since this promotion in some ways is derived from pro wrestling for the top Japanese name in the company to save face after losing the upset to a smaller countryman, Satake announced he was so mad about the decision that he was quitting the promotion. As the week went on, Satake was more insistent he wouldn't return. Tokyo Sports wrote on October 6 that Satake would wind up with either Rings or Pride, and they'd built up to a match against Naoya Ogawa, which would pit Japan's most famous kickboxer against its most famous judo star. In the fight, Satake scored a knockdown in the first round, winning it 10-8 on all the judges' cards, but all three judges gave the remaining 4 rounds to Musashi, although no knockdowns were scored the remainder of the fight. Promoter Kazuyoshi Ishii talked with Satake for 30 minutes after the show but was unable to change his mind about quitting due to protesting the decision, although Ishii said he felt it was a fair decision, and the reports we were given indicated the same thing. Filipovic, in the opener, in one night made himself a new major star with the organization with a knockout of perennial top contender Mike Bernardo of South Africa, in just 1/20 of the first round. Filipovic knocked Bernardo down 3 times using a barrage of punches and high kicks to get what was reported as a great show off the ground. Filipovic, unknown in Japan, looked to have been a highly touted opponent to be squashed and give Bernardo a path into the finals. In the second match, Greco from Australia beat Stefan Liko in a unique finish. After 2 low kicks in the third round, Greco was unable to continue. They went at that point to the scorecards, and Greco was leading 30-29 on 2 cards with a 30-30 draw on the other card, so since Liko fouled Greco, who would be unable to continue, and Greco was winning the fight at that point, he was awarded the victory. Lebanner of France, a top K1 star of the past who hasn't been active since signing with Don King, returned to knock out Matt Skelton of England with a series of punches at 1:59 of the first round. Hust of Holland went to the final 8 once again, winning a unanimous decision over Kavit Bayrami. Sefo of New Zealand scored 3 knockdowns en route to a win over Samir Benazis of Morocco. Hoke, the most popular kickboxer in the world, knocked out Japanese pro boxer Hiromi Amada, who is being groomed for future K1 stardom, in 1:51 of the first round, with Amada taking several leg kicks, resulting in 2 knockdowns, and Hoke scoring a 3rd knockdown to end the fight after a beautiful spinning kick to the face. To guarantee that at least one Japanese fighter made the finals, K1's top 2 native fighters, Musashi and Masaaki Satake, faced off in the semifinal on the show. Satake, who captured the K1 Japanese Grand Prix tournament in 1998, was the decided favorite against Musashi, won the same tournament this year which didn't include Satake. However, Musashi won the unanimous decision 48-46 on all 3 judges' cards. The main event was pushed as a major grudge match in the press, with defending champion Aerts taking on fellow Dutch fighter Lloyd van Damme. The storyline pushed is that Aerts and his former trainer had a falling out, and his trainer joined up with van Damme to train him to score the upset. Aerts wound up with a unanimous decision, but in a very close fight, with 2 judges scoring at 50-49 and the third scoring at 50-48, meaning basically that Aerts on 2 cards only won 1 round and the other 4 rounds were judged evenly. The ratings were down across the board this week as the problems from overexposure became apparent. Unlike in previous weeks, the disappointing numbers didn't exclude WWF. While Raw, which will be the last show of them all to notice effects from overexposure since in most of the public sight is the main show worth seeing, still had strong numbers, every other program during the week drew numbers that would be considered below par, although in the case of SmackDown, that wouldn't be noticeable to people just viewing the rating itself and not the circumstances. Raw finished with a 5.92 rating, 5.92 first hour, 5.92 seconds hour, and an 8.7 share. The show in the first hour showed the normal pattern of growth, on par with it doing a rating well into the low 6s. There was a huge drop-off, as the show peaked of all things with the Ivory and Miss Kitty vs. Moolah and Young match at a 6.68 rating, destroying the 2.12 rating for the Kidman vs. Juventud Guerrera match, which probably tells you more than you'll ever need to know about what a 4-star match on paper means in the ratings. Nitro fell to a 2.89 rating, 3.62 first hour, 2.45 seconds hour, 2.64 third hour, and a 4.3 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Raw drew a 5.92 rating to Nitro's 2.47, doubling the Nitro audience in every quarter except the first and tripling it in the aforementioned quarter. The drop-off of nearly a full point in the combined wrestling rating can't be blamed on a strong football game, since the 13.96 rating and 24.0 share was well below the early season average. The HART vs. Benoit match, which went against all the current television bylaws by going 27-33 when it's established that except for the main event, fans lose interest in most television matches past 7 minutes, didn't come close to Raw's rating, but did see the audience increase 31% over the 30-minute period, which was from the 2.12 of the previous quarter to a 2.45 in the first half of the match to a 2.77 for the second half of the match. In the main event battle, WWF with Rock vs. Jericho, a 5.56 final quarter hour but grew 6.53 on the overrun. WCW with Flair and Hogan vs. Sting and Luger did a 2.84 rating, but that's misleading because Nitro went 4 minutes longer, so the reality as far as competitive rating is more along the lines of a 2.5. On September 30th, SmackDown going unopposed, except on the West Coast where the shows aired head-to-head, as far as wrestling programming due to the Atlanta Braves being on TBS, drew a 4.05 rating and a 6.6 share. The number is in line with what the show has been averaging, but without a competitive wrestling show there is no explanation for not doing a record number. Thunder, with virtually no publicity out that the show would be starting late, and it ended up starting 3 hours late since the baseball game went into extra innings, set its all-time record low airing from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. with a 1.2 rating. The UPN Shasta McNasty special, which aired in the last 30 minutes of the regular SmackDown time slot, with a pro wrestling tie-in, did a 3.09 rating, which will most likely be the second high-rated show on the network this week. The September 23rd SmackDown show featuring the Five Faces of Helmsley and its 4.3 rating was back down to number 85 out of 118 primetime shows. UPN beat out both Fox and WB on Thursday, but it wasn't enough to keep them out of last place for the week. Keeping the rating at 4.3 shows the loyalty of the core wrestling audience, because the 3 of the 6 highest-rated shows of the week, including the top 2, Friends and Frasier, on NBC went head-up with the WWF. The show beat the season openers of Friends and Frasier among teens and beat all programming except NBC among men 18 and 34. ECW on TNN fell to its lowest mark to date with an 0.71 rating and 1.3 share. The first of the 2 Roller Jam games did an 0.68 rating, so the shows were almost identical, but the second Roller Jam game fell to an 0.55. The rest of the weekend numbers saw Livewire at 1.5, Superstars at 1.8 and Sunday Night Heat at 3.60. WCW Saturday Night remained at the 1.4 level, despite the recent changes putting more angles into the show that have largely been praised, making it the lowest rated show on TBS from 4 p.m. to midnight. In these days of pay-per-view oversaturation with a show nearly every Sunday, can yet another group play ball without any television relying on the curiosity of seeing names from the past? Bill Stone of Fawstone Promotions is hoping nostalgia will pay off with his Heroes of Wrestling pay-per-view on October 10th from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. According to Stone, he needs 41,000 buys to break even, which would be about a 0.11 buy rate, and if the show is successful, the plan would be to run 3 more similar events in 2000. ECW, with a strong cult following and some television exposure, is hovering at just under twice that figure. WCW has fallen to a little more than 1/3 of that figure with 6 hours of first-run national television per week. Now, more than ever, pro wrestling is a business about today with a largely young fan base whose idea of ancient history is a match in the summer of 1997. Many so-called third-party wrestling PPVs have been tried over the years, with only the recent string of ECW events and the AAA When Worlds Collide show in 1994 being the only ones to measure much more than a blip on the buy rate radar screen, and many have done less than 10,000 buys. But this show, if nothing else, is loaded with names recognizable to every older wrestling fan, most of whom have been out of the public spotlight, aside from working indie dates around the country seen by a limited audience, for years. Nostalgia acts to work as an infrequent gimmick in the music world. If there is any true market for wrestling nostalgia, then this show should pique curiosity buys. But the timing, which is everything in entertainment, may also be 1 year too late since wrestling PPVs, due to being almost weekly, are leveling off in the WWF and declining heavily in WCW. The addition of more weekly television due to SmackDown and ECW on TNN, free television, makes spending more money for pay-per-view a harder sell. The WWF legal team may have been at work as well, as the lineup given in the press packages list wrestlers with their stage name. But television ads that ran this past week list the two WWF created gimmicks on the show, Yokozuna and the Bushwhackers, as the artists formerly known as. The current card listed has the artist formerly known as Yokozuna vs. King Kong Bundy, Jim Neidhart vs. Jake Roberts, Bob Orton vs. Jimmy Snuka managed by Lou Albano, Abdullah the Butcher vs. One Man Gang, Tully Blanchard vs. Stan Lane, Greg Valentine vs. George Steele managed by Sherry Martel, Luke and Butch, billed as formerly the Bushwhackers, vs. Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, Marty Jannetty and Tommy Rogers vs. Samoan SWAT team, who I'd presume would be Samula Anoya and Sam Fatu, since Sola Fafatu of the original SSD is under contract still with WWF, and Two Cold Scorpio vs. Julio Sanchez. Gordon Soley and Dutch Mantle will handle the commentary. Japanese television rundown. September 15th, Gia. This was one of the company's two biggest shows of the year, headlined by the return Lioness Asuka vs. Chigusa Nagayo match, and they sold out Yokohama Bunka Gym for it. Judging from the TV setup and having been in the building, there is no way the 6,300 claim of attendance was legit. I'd guess from the looks of things the real number would be around 4,500. This was a really good major show, on the level of the best pay-per-view shows in the US this year. 1. Sonoko Kato pinned Toshie Uematsu in 15:38 after a dragon suplex and a spin kick. Kato is a former Chigusa trainee who is now with Asuka's group. The early part of the match didn't have much heat, but they didn't miss much and worked at a good pace, and the match built well. Strong opener. 3 stars. 2. Ri pinned Kaori Nakayama in 12:23. Mainly a brawl-style match with some blood and objects being used. Nakayama was all bloody from Ri using a stick. 1¼ stars. 3. Devil Masami pinned Sakura Hirota in 9:47. Hirota came out to Masami's music, doing the old Superhill Devil Masami gimmick, which Masami took as basically a female Undertaker no-selling monster gimmick. Masami got a huge pop coming out. It was mainly comedy and pretty bad. Masami, who is 37, but has 21 years of wrestling this style, is huge and can hardly move from obvious hip and knee problems. It's really quite sad because even a few years ago she could and on big shows had great matches, and now on her own it looks like she'd be hard-pressed to outwork the Iron Sheik. She won with a powerbomb. Dud. 4. Akira Hokuto and Mayumi Ozaki beat Etsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda in 15:03. This was a 4-way juicefist brawl, but that's really all it was. Hokuto, since coming back from giving birth, is nowhere near what she once was. All 4 did their trademark spots and dives, but there was not much except bad brawling in between. Shimoda did a cool move that I guess could be described as a somersault off the top rope into a rocker dropper, famouser. Finish saw Ozaki hit Mita with a chair while Hokuto used her Northern Lights bomb on Shimoda for a double pin. 1¾ stars. 5. Sugar Sato and Chikeo Nagashima retained the AW tag titles, beating Toshio Yamada and Kaoru in 15:33. Kaoru climbed up the light stand and did a moonsault block off it, which was pretty good. Sato did a double foot stomp off the top rope to the floor. A lot of good near falls, ending with Nagashima pinning Kaoru with a spinning back fist. 3½ stars. 6. In the match that stole the show, Asia Kong retained the AW title, pinning Meiko Satomura in 21:24. Kong killed her much smaller opponent for several minutes. Total destruction. Kong even did a tope. Satomura would be cut off, making her comebacks. The psychology ended up working great because the match ended with great heat and intensity. Satomura did a backward drop kick and they teased a 10-count knockout of Kong, who then got up and did a German suplex. Kong tried an elbow off the top, but Satomura caught the arm for an armbar in a great spot, which got the crowd into the match as Kong struggled for the ropes. The next several minutes saw Kong hit big moves for near falls, while Satomura kept teasing her Death Valley driver, which she used to pin Kong in a tag match earlier. Kong went for the spinning back fist, but it was blocked and Satomura hit the Death Valley driver for a near fall. Kong was about to lose and hit a desperation spinning back fist. Kong went for a superplex, but Satomura turned it into a power bomb off the top for a near fall. Satomura blocked another spinning back fist and turned it into a reverse armbar for a good cope break. Kong hit a spinning back fist again and a choke, but Satomura made the ropes. Kong hit yet another spinning back fist, this time getting the 3 count. 4¼ stars. 7. Chigusa Nagayo pinned Lioness Asuka in 1947 to win back the promotion. The streamers were 2 feet deep in the ring. It was really a sight seeing Asuka do a double foot stomp off the apron to the floor while everyone was buried in streamers. They started doing table spots with a table that wouldn't break until finally Asuka piledrover her through it. They both climbed the light stand with Nagio kicking Asuka off, and she took a bump off the stand through another table backwards, similar to the one Vince McMahon did but not from as much height. Nagio went for a superplex, but Asuka knocked her off the ropes and she went backwards onto another table that didn't break. These tables are much thicker than the ones used in the US, and that looked like it hurt. They started brawling in the crowd with Asuka working over Nagio's knee. Asuka put a table on Nagio and did a double foot stomp off the top rope onto the table. They brawled on the ramp and Nagio clotheslined Asuka off and then did a crossbody off the ramp. Asuka power bombed her off the ramp to the floor. They traded several more near falls until Nagio blew fire and hit a Death Valley driver, and there was a huge pop for the pin. They didn't make up and reform their team as we reported. Nagio wanted to shake hands and Asuka wouldn't. They were staring at each other for a long time doing a big tease, but they're saving it for later. 3.5 stars. September 18th, Pancrase. This pay-per-view show was decent. There were more finishes than have been typical on a Pancrase show, at least partially because 2 of the quick Pancradion matches were one-sided bookings. The show lacked a spectacular match, but nothing was too bad either. Pancrase has changed its rules, eliminating the point system and rope breaks, which Pancrase adopted since it started with its base of rules as an offshoot of Work Shoot Pro Wrestling, and has since changed rules as they've learned. The rope breaks were good in the infancy, because the matches at first were all too short because guys would win with submissions. As the fighters have learned to avoid submissions, the matches more often than not go the time limit, and the rope break allowed matches to continue without clean finishes, and now they need as many clean finishes as they can get. As it turned out, that rule change didn't noticeably affect any match on this show except the opener where the submission was in the ropes. 1. Yoshiki Takahashi beat Asami Shibuya in 6:08 with a front guillotine. Takahashi unloaded on Shibuya at the bell, got the mount and pounded on him with slaps. Shibuya rolled him but was caught in a guard, and at one point got behind him and went for a choke. After the 2 men traded slaps standing, Shibuya went for a takedown and was caught in a front guillotine. 2. Semi-Shield beat Ikuiza Minowa via unanimous decision after 15 minutes. The size difference was far too much for Minowa, coming off his Neo Blood tournament win, to overcome. Minowa got a quick takedown, but Schultz rolled him and out-wrestled him for the next several minutes, throwing a lot of blows from the top and going for an over-under choke. Minowa got away from that but was still getting hit with open hands from the top. At 10 minutes, the ref called for a stand-up. Minowa tried another takedown, but Schultz got the top and kept pounding. Minowa ended up with a bloody nose. The decision seemed pretty easy. 3. Kosei Kubota beat Susumu Yamazaki via unanimous decision after 10 minutes. I believe Yamazaki was originally from Shudo while Kubota is a Pancrase regular. Kubota took him down and slapped the hell out of him for the first 2 minutes. From that point on he went for submissions but never came close. At the end, Yamazaki blocked an attempted takedown and went for a guillotine. Kubota easily won the decision. 4. In a Pancradion Valley Tudo rules match, Sanae Kikuta beat Eddie Millis of the Shark Tank in 1:54 with a flurry of punches from the mount and the referee stopping the fight. 5. In another Pancradion rules match, Akira Shoji from Pride went to a 15-minute draw with Ryushi Yanagisawa. In Pancrase Valley Tudo matches don't have judges under Pancradion rules, although this would have been very difficult to call because it was such a close fight. Shoji, who was smaller by probably 7 inches in height and maybe 22 pounds, got on top in the guard and threw a decent amount of punches, dominating the first 5 minutes. Yanagisawa got up, and the next 6 minutes were largely the two dancing on their feet with nobody hitting any combinations, hurting the other or getting much of an advantage. Yanagisawa started connecting with leg kicks, so he was gaining the advantage as it wore on. After a real strong slugfest with both connecting, it wound up on the ground with Kikuta on top in the guard, but Yanagisawa connected a lot more from the bottom. I'd call it a draw. 6. In the final Pancradion rules match, Masakatsu Funaki beat Tony Patara of the Shark Tank in 1:17. They were slugging it out standing, with neither showing much technique, but Funaki decked Patara with a left. He got a mount and started pounding with Patara unable to stop him, and the ref stopped it in 1:17.7. Yuki Kondo retained the King of Pancrase title, beating Kyuma Kunyoku in 40 seconds. They were trading slaps standing when Kondo hit a strong flying knee which knocked Kunyoku down. Kondo got on top and started throwing open hands in the ropes. As Kunyoku looked like he was going to fall through the ropes, a stand-up was called, but the ref saw that Kunyoku was out and stopped the fight. His jaw looked to be knocked out of whack from the knee as it was swollen, and he was bleeding pretty badly from the mouth.
When the ref helped him to his feet, he lost his legs completely and collapsed in the ref's arms.
After these two had gone the time limit in their 3 previous matches, this kind of a finish was definitely a surprise. September 18th, New Japan.
This was more matches from Jingu Stadium.
The show opened airing a repeat of the Great Muta vs. Great Nita match, as if they needed to have people see that fiasco again. 2. Tatsuhiro Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani retained the IWGP Junior Tag titles, beating Jushin Liger and El Samurai in 15 minutes. It was the typical fast-action match, but probably because of the stadium setting, the heat wasn't there and it took away from the match. A lot of near falls and saves. Finish saw Takaiwa lariat Liger and then Otani got the spin on Liger with a spider, spinning power bomb.
3 1/4 stars, 3.
Don Fry beat Scott Norton in 7:53.
Norton was pretty bad here.
Actually, Fry did a good job carrying it.
Early on they tried to do technical mat work, but fans aren't into Norton in that role and he's not good at it either. Fans did pop when Norton powered out of an armbar with a one-arm back suplex. Norton was cut above the left eye.
After a ref bump, Norton messed up a power slam spot off the ropes. He was setting up the power bomb but saw the ref was down. As he went to help up Masao Hattori, Fry gave him a low blow, got a mount and threw one punch after another until Norton turned and Fry got the choke and the ref stopped the match.
After the match, Fry decked 3 of the young New Japan wrestlers who tried to break things up.
1 1/4 stars, 4. Masahiro Chono beat Shinya Hashimoto in 15:45. Match was so-so early but built well. Chono is so limited in what he can do now, but Hashimoto can make a match by selling and making his great comebacks. Chono's Yakuza kicks were off.
Hashimoto's kicks to the chest as a comeback were great, and set up a Sankakujim, crooked head scissors. They tried some near falls before Chono hit a low blow, put the SDF on again, but combined it with an armbar. Hashimoto was caught in a hold for a while before the ref stopped it.
The finish was a little flat.
2 3/4 stars.
September 25th, New Japan. This was a depressing show because it had such poor production values combined with non-existent crowd heat, even though the matches were technically fine and in some cases good. It was reminiscent of a really weak All Japan taping, and it was the first time New Japan came across minor league looking this year. The show opened with Antonio Inoki coming out with Naoya Ogawa to hype the Tokyo Dome match with Hashimoto, who came out and they yelled at each other. Fans react to Ogawa like he's somebody important. They also showed clips of Fry training with Hashimoto. The matches that aired were all from the G1 Tag Team Tournament. 1. Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita beat Brian Johnston and Takashi Iizuka in 13:37.
No heat.
Johnston looked green on his high spots, but his fighting, knees and kicks, looked great. He'd be perfect for ring style. They did a nice spot where Sasaki used a one-armed power bomb on Iizuka, who caught him in an armbar for a rope break, but even that didn't get any heat. Finish saw Sasaki and Fujita do a double spear on Iizuka and Sasaki pinned him after a lariat. 1 1/4 stars, 2.
Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto beat Fry and Masahiro Chono in 11:54.
Another dead match, amazing since it was Chono and Fry. They did all the stuff that usually works, but this crowd was just about impossible. Finish saw a ref bump and Ohara hit Chono with a row of chairs and Goto lariated Chono for the pin. January 2 1 stars, 3. In another upset, Shiro Koshinaka and Junji Hirata beat Hashimoto and Meng in 9:36. This would have been a good match in another setting as everyone's offense was very strong, but again no heat. Hirata pinned Meng clean with a machine suplex, and the crowd wasn't expecting that to be the finish. 1 3/4 stars, 4.
Muto and Norton beat Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi in 15:31.
This wasn't the championship match, but their earlier round-robin match. Most of the match saw Muto get his knee worked over. Since Nagata is such a good wrestler and Muto worked almost the entire match, this was good, and when they were in together it was really good. Nakanishi twice racked Muto, but he got away both times. Norton power slammed Nagata but was then caught in a triangle choke and armbar for a teased finish, but Muto saved.
Norton then power bombed Nagata.
3 1/4 stars. Mexico. In what from a historical standpoint would be the biggest mask lost in a long time, El Hijo del Santo has a mask versus mask match against Fishman on October 10th in Juarez. Fishman, 48, whose career is coming to a close, was a huge star in the 70s and early 80s with a legendary feud against Pero Aguayo. Santo also puts his mask on the lie against the hair of Sergio Galvez on October 17th. Shocker has now bleached his hair blonde after losing his mask and is talking English on the PA to get heel heat. He continued to feud with Mr. Niebla on October 1st at Arena Mexico, ripping up his mask and leaving it. Villano Tercero also ripped up Atlantis' mask, continuing their angle. Mil Mascaras and Dos Caras and Connect formed a Legends trio as the main event for AAA on October 2nd in Tecomán. Atlantis beat Villano Tercero on September 27th in Puebla to keep the CMLL light heavyweight title.
They will be hanging a plaque of legendary heel Cavernario Galindo, who passed away recently, on October 5th at Arena Coliseo.
Negro Casas won a hair versus hair match over Bestia Salvaje in a bloodbath before 6,000 fans in Guadalajara. Damien and Halloween are headed to Peru, Chile, Ecuador and Colombia to try and open up a group to run out of that part of the world. American tapes, in particular Raw and Nitro, are huge on television in Peru right now. All Japan and next tour lineups were announced with nothing out of the ordinary.
The first night is October 9th at Korakuen Hall with Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama and Kentaro Shiga vs Takao Omori and Yoshihiro Takayama and Masa Fuchi, Akira Taue and Jun Izumida vs Stan Hansen and Gary Albright, Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Jinsei Shinzaki vs Johnny Ace and Mike Burton and Giant Kimala 2 plus an all-Asian tag tournament match with Tamon Honda and Masao Inoue vs Johnny Smith and Manukia Mossman.
October 10th at Korakuen Hall has Battlers Daisuke Ikeda in his first All-Japan main event, teaming with Kobashi and Akiyama vs Ace and Burton and Smith.
October 11th in Kyoto is headlined by Misawa and Ogawa and Ikeda vs Kobashi and Akiyama and Shiga.
October 16th in Osaka is headlined by Misawa and Ogawa and Masamichi Marufuji vs Kobashi and Akiyama and Yoshinobu Kanemaru. October 20th in Shizuoka is headlined by Misawa and Ogawa and Shinzaki vs Ace and Burton and Smith. The October 23rd Nagoya show features the Misawa and Ogawa tag title defense against Kobashi and Akiyama, which looks to be the best match of the tour.
Also on that show is Takayama vs Albright, Amori vs Shinzaki and an Asia tag tourney match with Honda and Inoue vs Ikeda and Masahito Kakihara.
The All-Asian Tag Tourney final is October 25th in Niigata, and the only match announced for October 30th at Budokan is the Misawa vs Vader Triple Crown match. September 19th TV did and September 26th TV shows both did 2.5 ratings. New Japan. Most of the talk this past week has been building up the Shinya Hashimoto vs Naoya Ogawa match for October 11th.
Ogawa regained the NWA title on October 2nd in Thomaston, Connecticut from Gary Steele when Steele's manager, Tony Rumble, turned on him and hit him with his helmet.
There was talk during the week of either Antonio Inoki or Tatsumi Fujinami being the referee, and at last word it looks as though it will be Fujinami. Ticket sales are said to be ahead of the pace of New Japan's last two major shows, Tokyo Dome headlined by Keiji Muto vs Don Frye and Jingu Stadium headlined by Muta vs Nita, but it's not sold out. This shows how far the company has fallen because the January 4th match got so much mainstream press and it figured that a rematch would be an easy advanced sellout. Fujinami on October 5th said that it would not be an NWA title match, although Ogawa said he was mad it wasn't. Each man will get 1 second at ringside. Ogawa's second will be Kazunari Murakami.
They haven't announced Hashimoto's second, but it may be Takashi Iizuka because legit in January in the melee after the Ogawa-Hashimoto match, Murakami was injured by Iizuka. Both men are to wear gloves and punches are legal.
There are no count-outs.
Former college rugby star Kenzo Suzuki returned from Calgary after training for the past 2 months under Joe Daigo, during which time his weight went from 240 to 265 pounds.
Many pro wrestlers are appearing as part of the 1999 Wrestling Festival to benefit the Japanese Olympic wrestling team. The festival will be from December 21st to December 23rd, at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym No. 2 and feature both the men's and women's national championships in amateur.
Among the matches that will take place among pro wrestlers, as pro wrestling matches, not amateur shoot matches, are Manabu Nakanishi vs Masakazu Fukuda, Yuji Nagata vs Kazuyuki Fujita from New Japan and from All Japan, Masamichi Marufuji and Tamon Honda vs Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Masafuchi.
In addition, they are trying to put together Yoshiaki Yatsu vs Alexander Otsuka and some women's matches. Yoshiki Takahashi of Pancrase and Kazushi Sakuraba of Pride are also to appear. Nakanishi, Nagata, Fujita and Honda were all national champions in amateur wrestling before going into pro wrestling. September 18th TV show did a 3.0 rating and September 25th did a 1.9. Other Japan notes: The biggest show of a slow week in Japan was the Jackie Sato Memorial Card on September 29 for AJW before a sellout 3,780 at Tokyo Ota Ward Gymnasium. The main event saw Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda retain the WWA tag titles, beating Momoe Nakanishi and Nani Takahashi in a best-of-3 fall match. The biggest thing on the show was airing old videos of Sato on the video screen. Fans were singing the songs that played on the screen of her concerts. Maki Ueda, her original tag team partner as the beauty pair and later her biggest drawing foe, was at the show. Sato, who passed away about 6 weeks ago at the age of 41 due to cancer, was the biggest women's wrestling star of the 70s. The Yomiuri newspaper, which is the largest newspaper in the world and which traditionally doesn't touch pro wrestling, ran a story that morning about what a cultural icon of the late 70s that Sato was. It also noted that Japanese women's wrestling is regaining some of its former popularity as a television event since the August 8 TV show head-to-head more than tripled All Japan, 4.4 to 1.2, and delivered an amazing 52.2 share. Michinoku Pro will be holding its annual tag team tournament from October 23 to November 7, finishing in Sendai at the new World Tennis Club. Teams are Great Sasuke and Masaaki Mochizuki Tiger Mask, and Magnum Tokyo, Shima and Suwa, Sumo Fuji and Curry Man, Christopher Daniels, and Sasuke the Great and Fake Naniwa. I got a chance to see the final night of the mask tournament, and it was a great show. They had a 6-man tag which included Magnum Tokyo, Curry Man, Superboy and Shima, which was tremendous. The Tiger Mask vs. Dos Caras match was one of those bouts where, since Dos Caras was a big name for decades, Tiger basically gave him the whole match since he was going over at the end. Caras, who listed at 48, some sources peg him as a few years older, put on a total technical mat wrestling clinic. You'll see more unique wrestling moves in that match than you'll see in at least a year of WWF shows. Also saw a Sasuke vs. Naniwa match. It was the match the real Naniwa suffered the elbow injury in, from Sapporo, from that same tour that would have been an easy 4.5 stars match by the old standards. Crowd wasn't into it even though they were doing big spots as people have just seen everything. There was a botched up Super Frankensteiner. Kendo will also be appearing on that tournament series. Although nothing has been announced, there's talk that Jeremy Horn and Brad Kohler, who Akira Maeda would have seen at the UFC show, will be in the Rings tournament. Big Japan is doing a deathmatch tag team tournament from October 27 to November 8 with the finals in Sapporo. Shadow WX retained the Big Japan deathmatch title, beating Mike Samples on October 3 in Kawasaki. Kamikaze and Shunmei Matsuzaki retained their tag titles over Abdullah the Butcher and Daikokubo Benkei on the same show. Asia Kong defends the Queen Aversion title against Michiko Omukai on November 3 in Tokyo. Gia has a tournament October 9 to October 11. FMW on October 29 at Karakuen Hall features female ballet and porn star Sina Wakana and male porn star Chocoball Mukai teaming with Flying Kitty Chihara in a 1-on-3 with Geto. Satoru Sayama's Seikendo promotion apparently drew 6,500 fans, at least that was the announced figure, to the Ariake Coliseum on October 2 for mainly boxing matches. His next tour, which consists of 4 shows from November 2 to November 16 with the major show November 5 in Yokohama Bunka Gym, will have more of a pro wrestling emphasis, using the guys from Battlearts like Ikuto Hidaka and Minoru Tanaka, plus Sayama, Mitsuya Nagai, formerly Rings and K1, Tatsuo Nakano, former UWFI, and Tiger Mask. He has negotiated with Victor Quiñones about using WWF talent, and Sayama claims he'll have several huge names on the tour. Here and there. In continuation over the NWA Tag title silliness, Knuckles Nelson and Dukes Dalton regained the NWA Tag titles in New England, beating Curtis Slamdog and Jay Cobain on October 2 in Thomaston, Connecticut. Nelson and Dalton were scheduled to lose the belts at the anniversary show to Team Extreme out of Dallas, but dropped them a few days earlier to Slamdog and Cobain, then dropped them again as scheduled. So for New England, Slamdog and Cobain then gave them back, so they are still calling themselves NWA Tag Champs in their own territory since there is no national pub in the first place. Hey, if WCW can screw around with the Cruiserweight belt with nobody caring, then who cares about a tag title recognized but not used in a lot of small companies? Doug Gilbert came out of a box to do a brawl with Brian Christopher as the top angle in Memphis on October 2. Since he was in Memphis doing the angle, Gilbert missed the Eddie Gilbert Memorial Brawl held that same evening in Vineland, New Jersey, and Father Tommy Gilbert wrestled in his place before an estimated 350 fans, teaming with John Cronus to beat Public Enemy. They did a deal at the show where Jim Cornette said that Brandon Baxter had joined his organization. Baxter denied doing so and Kevin Christian came out and told him not to kayfabe everyone and Christian said he'd have videotape proof next week. Announcer Dave Brown shrugged his shoulders and said stranger things have happened, and Baxter got mad at Brown saying sarcastically thanks for the vote of confidence. Prime Minister Film and Videotape Company, which owns the rights to lots of old pro wrestling videos, is offering a free 1-hour tape for anyone who places an order with them and mentions the Observer. Art Barr's older brother Jesse, wrestling under the name Jimmy Jack Funk, the name he used as Dory Funk's tag team partner in the WWF, returned to wrestling at the age of 43 after taking 2 years off due to a car accident and worked over the weekend in Hawaii.
The first show, featuring no major names, drew 1,250 fans in Hilo, and the second show drew 122 fans on Kona. Ohio Valley Wrestling 2 weeks back did a very nice television tribute by Jim Cornette to Brian Hildebrand.
Amateur wrestling historian Mike Chapman is coming out with a new book on the life of Frank Gotch, the first American pro wrestling world champion that is due out around Christmas. In what is being billed as the final match of his career, Jackie Fargo, 66, faces Jerry Lawler in a cage match on Thanksgiving night for NWA Worldwide in Nashville. MMA. The only official news of the week is that Pancrase announced 3 Pancratian Vale Tudo Rules matches to headline its October 25th show at Korakuen Hall. 2 of them feature Midwest regulars Adrian Serrano, who faces Ihuiza Minowa, and Travis Fulton, who faces Sanae Kikuta, and the third being Kosei Kubota versus John Oresio, who is an unknown.
There are rumors regarding both Henzo and Royler Gracie fighting on the November 21st Pride show.
As the stories go, Henzo would face Alexander Otsuka and Royler would face Kazushi Sakuraba. In a sense, from a Japanese booking perspective, they make sense because Sakuraba likely wouldn't lose to Royler, who pound for pound is an awesome fighter but is 150 pounds tops, while Sakuraba is about 190, although Royler did beat 215-pound Naoki Sano in a shoot, but Sano is a pro wrestler who got hammered in all his Vale Tudo fights.
And if Otsuka lost to Henzo, it would be okay since Otsuka has already lost to Nobuhiko Takada and Henzo has the Gracie name. Actually, that match is pretty much all upside for Otsuka, even though Henzo is a little bit smaller, because Henzo has the name. In the Sakuraba match, the idea would be that the promotion is playing it safe, because in reality, what does it prove if Sakuraba beats Royler?
Visually, unless he finishes him clean, Royler will look like a winner just surviving against someone that much bigger. And even if he does finish him clean, sure, he's the first Japanese fighter to cleanly beat a Gracie, but he's so much larger. ECW. The November 7th November to Remember show won't be in Indianapolis due to a problem with the building. There are several sites being talked about, including the Stabler Arena in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but nothing was confirmed at press time. As things stand at this point, the top matches on the show look to be Mike Awesome vs. Masato Tanaka for the ECW title, Tommy Dreamer and Raven vs. Justin Credible and Lance Storm for the tag team titles, either Jerry Lynn vs. Yoshihiro Tajiri or a 3-way with Super Crazy added, and possibly Rob Van Dam vs. Taz for the TV title. No decision has been made regarding the future of the ECW House of Hardcore school that Taz was running. Mark Coleman of UFC fame is going to be getting a tryout before the show this coming weekend in New Orleans. TNN show that didn't draw a rating still featured mostly very good work, unfortunately with people that aren't considered marquee television stars. The opener saw Mike Awesome beat Rhino to keep the title in 4:26 with a splash off the top after a powerbomb over the top rope through a table.
Rhino needs a new haircut as he looks too much like every young kid who wants to be a wrestler.
Heyman clearly likes him and he's definitely got potential. Awesome is now being billed as 6'6", 292, which is a little more realistic. This was a good high-impact television match. Awesome may kill himself someday doing that great dive of his outside the ring at his size. Spike Dudley won a handicap match over Little Guido and Sal E. Graziano. It started as a singles match with Graziano, and then Guido interfered right in front of the ref and it turned into a handicap match.
Really, it was Guido versus Spike for most of the match. It was a good match. The finish saw Spike use the acid drop on both and then pin both at the same time.
It was an entertaining wrestling match, but the finish was a little hard to take. They spent the TV show building around the idea that Dreamer and Raven had a fist fight backstage. They also really pushed Tammy Sytch's return very hard on both TV shows. It was pushed a lot harder than you'd think for someone who is far from a sure thing for the long term. Maybe the feeling is that since she does have some name recognition as national curiosity from Titan, like when Elizabeth returned after a many-year absence and popped a huge rating for WCW, maybe that'll work as well. They announced a October 8 TNN taping for Houma, Louisiana.
They aired the dark match from the Chicago pay-per-view show with During and Roadkill over C.W. Anderson and Bill Wiles.
Anderson is another guy with a bad hairline from the Carolinas using the Anderson name.
Roadkill pinned Wiles in 4:03 after a splash off the top.
It was another good match with everyone working hard. Just no star power in there at all. Finally, Yoshihiro Tajiri pinned Dreamer in 11:46 of a good brawl with really good heat.
Steve Corino pulled the ref out of the ring. Francine used a pedigree on Corino.
It really exposes finishing moves when someone like Francine can do them, but it was Triple H's move they were exposing. Anyway, Raven DDT'd Dreamer when it looked like he was coming in to save him. The storyline they were pushing is that Raven hates Dreamer and will cause him to lose when the tag belts aren't on the line.
Syndicated show had During and Roadkill over Jazz and Nova when Roadkill pinned Jazz after a power slam.
Crowd was in the match. Joey Styles subtly ripped on TNN, which wouldn't let them air a match like this because it's a man versus a woman. Rhino beat Christopher Daniels in a really good match taped a few months back. This was a hell of a match. Daniels, who was on the small side, looked really good in carrying the match, losing at the end. After the match, Spike came out and used the acid drop on Rhino. I have no idea why, even though it happened at the time, it was shown on TV since they are fixing to give Rhino a push. They did a video segment that probably should have aired on TNN, pushing the history of the ECW title belt from its inception. That was good. Finally, Lynn pinned Crazy with a cradle piledriver in a very good athletic match, and the crowd seemed to appreciate it a lot. The Carolinas tour saw shows September 30th in Spartanburg and October 2nd in Rock Hill both draw around 900, and the show in between in Asheville drew about 1,900. They used local wrestlers Mike Maverick, Murray Hafter, Otto Schwantz, and Marty Garner, Champagne, as the Duck Brothers, Bo, Jack and Pump. How about Blow? They were doing a country hit gimmick said to be a takeoff on the Larry, Darryl, and Darryl brothers from the old New Heart show. Vito Lograsso, Spanish Angel and Tony DeVito are doing a group called the Baldies and will feud with New Jack and Balls Mahoney and Axel Rotten in Bloodbath Garbage style matches. Rob Van Dam worked some of the weekend shows because the Carolinas promoter, Greg Price, is a longtime friend of his. He's still working sporadically because of his wife's broken leg. Van Dam wrestled Johnny Smith for the first time, a match which went 20 minutes. It was described as a good match by some and a boring match by others, but all agreed it went too long for the crowd. Smith also didn't get over with the crowd in singles matches against Awesome and Sabu. Crazy is out of action for a couple of weeks, as he's back in Mexico on vacation. WCW Nitro on October 4th at Kemper Arena in Kansas City drew 6,957 fans, of which 5,724 paid $156,134. They are already promoting the final Nitro episode of the century on December 27th, from Houston called New Year's Evil. They did a show-long skit with Goldberg and Sid. Sid tried to outsmart Goldberg but wound up with another car being smashed. All the wrestlers every week come out in limos, but when you see a superstar wrestler in a cheap car, somehow it's going to end up destroyed by the end of the show. Somewhere in the WCW rating budget, they should have a category of wasted money on all the limos they destroyed and all the money spent on these location things, like that time they rented helicopters for that horrible Ric Flair angle or that hardcore battle royal that we could barely see. Anyway, Malenko pinned Mysterio Jr. in 9:54 when Douglas, after a ref bump, came into the ring with a chain. Saturn ran in and grabbed the chain from him. Saturn and Douglas started arguing and it looked like Saturn would hit Douglas with the chain, but instead he hit Mysterio Jr., unbeknownst to Malenko, who then pinned him. Really good athletic wrestling. Even better than their match last week. After the match, Malenko acted like he was mad when he saw the finish on the video wall and helped Mysterio Jr. to his feet. Considering they replay all the finishes on the video wall, shouldn't the ref see them as well and it result in reversing decisions? Sorry for inflicting rational thinking. Mysterio Jr. subbed for Eddie Guerrero, who pulled a hamstring on September 26th in Huntsville, Alabama. It's not a serious injury and it was expected he'd be ready, but he arrived late. Psychosis came out as Cruiserweight champion. In the formats, Lenny Lane was supposed to defend the title as Lenny Lane as opposed to simply Lenny. I guess he was red flagged and Psychosis got a win in a match that never took place. Anyway, they announced Psychosis had won the title, pointing out that he never held the title as a masked wrestler. Actually, he did for 1 week, trying to get over how losing the mask has changed his career. Disco then pinned him with a stunner in 3:54 to win the title. Hall and Nash showed up to a pretty big pop and Gene Okerlund interviewed them. After all those months gone from TV,
Nash still hasn't come up with anything to say on a promo.
Nash had a black girl with him, I guess, to show he's cool. Hall acted like he was totally wasted. At least I hope he was acting. He did have a funny line about how Nash is working a retirement angle and said he'd be back wrestling when it was fun, and when Okerlund said something like it was, he told Okerlund that he hadn't been in the dressing room lately. Sid pinned Bryan Adams in 237 with a double-team powerbomb with help from Rick Steiner right in front of heel ref Charles Robinson.
They have Sid at 120-0, so now it's treated as a complete joke on the air. They have to get it to 172 by October 24th, so they have to count each win as 10.
Goldberg pinned Jerry Flynn in 326 with a spear, despite tons of interference by Morris and Knobbs. Pretty cool spot where Flynn trapped him in an armbar and Goldberg basically gave Flynn a one-armed powerbomb. Goldberg did an interview challenging Sid that wasn't very good. Berlin was hanging out doing nothing.
Brad Armstrong snatched him and neither did anything.
Harlem Heat did an interview, which turned into a brawl for several minutes with Morris and Knobbs to set up a tag title match at Havoc.
Knobbs hit both guys with hard chair shots while Hall and Nash laughed watching it.
Morris left Ray laying with a moonsault. They did another Nitro Girls segment.
Benoit did an interview very much unlike a typical pro wrestling interview. Throughout the show, Schiavone talked about how when the match took place he'd treat it differently than a typical match.
Heenan said he wouldn't. Too bad Heenan lived up to his word. Hennig returned pinning Brad Armstrong in 240 with a fisherman suplex after Berlin and the Bodyguard, who used to be Hellraiser in Northeast Indies, interfered. Kidman was coming out of a shower with Tori Wilson. Schiavone and Heenan said that Kidman was their hero.
Should be noted that during Mysterio Jr.'s match, Schiavone said that no other members of the Filthy Animals were there. Must have been a really long shower.
It'll be interesting to see if they can figure out something to do with Wilson. The current plan, and remember all plans are off the books, is for Wilson to double-cross Kidman next and wind up with Douglas, because Douglas and Francine worked as a combination. Anyway, Wilson is the most potentially marketable woman in this business, but instead of pushing her like the next Sable, they've got her in the role of the next Terry Runnels. Juventud Guerrera pinned Kidman in 11:51 when Psicosis crotched Kidman and Guerrera used a super juvie driver off the middle ropes on him. Kidman was remarkably alert in the ring after taking a 90-minute shower with Tori Wilson. Their typical excellent match. Harley Race did an interview and not once did he say the phrase, God's green earth. You have to be a 1970s Harley Race fan to get that one, but for newer readers, let's just say Harley Race in the 70s as a worker would be equivalent to probably Chris Benoit, or at least Benoit with a terrible body. Today, Hart beat Benoit with a sharpshooter. Fans chanted Owen early. There were a lot of references to Owen in signs. Match was a long slow build, but under the circumstances they could get away with it. It built into a really good match, particularly in the last few minutes. Hogan and Flair did an interview together that was pathetic. The two of them together putting each other over was a sight, but when it got down to Flair cupping his ear and Hogan imitating Flair, it was like this bad comedy spoof. Page pinned Bagwell with the diamond cutter in 323. It was fine. Flair and Hogan beat Sting and Luger in 705 when Hogan leg dropped Sting. Page tried to interfere but Luger racked him, thinking he was Flair. Flair was working heel spots with Sting, which was so strange, especially since you knew Flair was the one calling them and he's certainly been around long enough to know what he's doing. It was good when Flair was in. Hogan's knee is so shot he can barely move, and it was really bad when he was in. Pam Hildebrand was at Nitro in Atlanta on September 27th. They burned the ashes of Brian Hildebrand in the pyro that night, which was as he had requested. Devon Storm debuted on WCW Saturday Night, taped on September 28th in Rome, Georgia, losing to Kidman. Hector Garza was cleared to return after a succession of knee problems and worked house show matches. There are a lot of different plans as they pertain to television for next year. There is talk of making Thunder a 1-hour show and making Nitro a 2-hour show. There is an upside and downside to this. It's better as it regards stress of putting the shows together and not having to pad to fill time. It's worse in that cutting back on hours cuts back on ad revenue by the same percentage, which is one of the prime revenue sources of a wrestling company nowadays. The other interesting note is that if Nitro does cut back to 2 hours, and goes from 8:10 p.m., it means the second hour of Raw will probably be doing consistent 7s or more. In January, the plan is to move the Thunder tapings to Tuesday, so the wrestlers that are already on the road Monday won't be going home and coming back, and so it'll save on trans, and at the same time more of the top names will appear. WCW Saturday Night tapings will move to alternate Wednesdays, although there is still talk of turning that show into a highlights show rather than taping new material.
ICP is now apparently back in with WCW, although that will probably continue to change weekly.
The live Thunder on September 27th in Chattanooga was just about the worst Thunder in history. After all the blame on Bischoff for the problems and all the talk about how things are going to turn around, this show was not a good sign. Opener saw Juventud Guerrera and Psicosis and La Parca over Silver King and Los Villanos in 7:51 when Psicosis pinned V5 after a leg drop.
This was V4's first match back since undergoing neck surgery after what was thought to be a potential career-ending injury when Raven and Canyon mistimed a double-team spot.
Poor V4. In his first match back, he goes out and pulls a hamstring and was limping around. This was the only good match on the show. They did an angle in this match, but since the cameras missed it, it doesn't count. Silver King turned on the Villanos and walked out, which explains why Silver King is supposed to be in the new group with Psicosis, Juvie, etc., which may be called the top guys. Smiley beat Adrian Bird in 4:27 with a chicken wing. Mona did an interview.
Brandy Alexander attacked her with a high-heel shoe. They wrestled, had no heat and were out there way too long with Mona winning with a Frankensteiner off the top in 7:01.
Finish was good but can't say that about the rest of the match.
Dean Roll no contest Frankie Lancaster when Norton came out and destroyed both guys in 2:40. Roll is indie wrestler Shark Boy, who has the coolest gimmick. Apparently they may do something with the gimmick, and didn't want to ruin it, so as a jobber he's going under his real name.
Lancaster has a jacked up physique but looks to be about 100 years old. Norton challenged Goldberg, who later accepted. Morris and Knobs beat Regal and David Taylor in 7:03 when Morris pinned Taylor after a moonsault.
Regal has the world's greatest facial expressions.
But this was really bad as a match. The Revolution came out for an interview. Douglas apologized. Later when Douglas asked the crowd if they agreed with him about Out with Evolution, they booed him. I guess it's okay since he's turning anyway.
Bobby Eaton pinned Luther Biggs, managed by Coach Buzz Stern. Stern put Biggs and Eaton both in a full Nelson after the match.
Boy was this debut ever ed up. Brad Armstrong pinned Horace Hogan after a leg sweep in 4:15. Mysterio Jr. and Kidman beat Kendall Windham and Curly Bill, replacing Barry Windham whose knee is injured, when Mysterio Jr. pinned Bill after a Frankensteiner off the top in 7:43. Kidman had a black eye from the match with Storm 2 days earlier, but they credited it to his match on Nitro with Psicosis. He took an accidental knee. This was probably the best tag match you'll ever see Windham and Vincent in, which isn't to say it was that good. Mysterio Jr. looks so utterly ridiculous in the ring with any Windham. Goldberg beat Norton in 3:56. For this coming week it was Malenko over Blitzkrieg, subbing for Guerrera who arrived late for the show, and this was the opener at the house show. Disco over Evan Karagis, Brad Armstrong over Chris Adams, Jeff Torborg over Rob Kellum. Not sure what names these two went by because the ring announcing wasn't audible at the stands. Benoit beat Brian Knobbs in a good brawl. Lash LaRue beat Silver King. Mysterio Jr. and Kidman beat Disorderly Conduct and Sid pinned Stevie Ray. Needless to say, after this night ended there was a lot of frustration that nothing was changing. The only new names confirmed as being let go are Norton and Mike Enos. A lot of the wrestlers who are being let go may be used on $500 per match deals as opposed to being on contract. Norton was given an $800,000 per year contract by Bischoff, which given his market value was ridiculous on paper, although some of that, certainly not all, could be justified since they make money sending him to Japan. Terry and Ray Gordy were backstage at Thunder. House shows for the week saw WCW Saturday night tapings on September 28 in Rome, Georgia drew 1,373 paying $19,902. September 29 in Huntsville, Alabama drew 1,694 paying $37,075. September 30 in Chattanooga for Thunder drew 2,411 paying $50,005. October 1 in Wichita drew 4,093 paying $90,918. October 2 in Tulsa drew a sellout 7,406 paying $133,805, and October 3 in Oklahoma City drew 6,701 paying $150,750. Huntsville was headlined by Heat vs. Rednecks, so you had Kendall Windham and Curly Bill as main eventers along with Stevie Ray. I'm not sure who was no-showing, but they did fly DDP and Conan in as replacements for two headliners that weren't appearing. The Wichita, Tulsa and Oklahoma City house show run was headlined by Goldberg vs. Sid. WCW drew a rare sellout in Tulsa because that's the city where Goldberg grew up as a high school football star. Merchandise for the past week was selling at a $6.14 per head clip, probably due to strong Goldberg sales in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. A lot of the wrestlers will be based working out of Los Angeles from October 16th through November 16th for the filming of the movie, with them just flying out of Los Angeles to do television tapings.
The original Dan Crawford, not Phil LaFon, who took the ring name Dan Crawford because that was one of his favorite wrestlers when he was growing up, who was a 70s star in Calgary, was in Kansas City interviewing for a front office position.
I believe he was a successful Calgary booker in the 70s, but he was a top-drawing babyface in the promotion for many years, and was also the guy who lost the United National Championship to Antonio Inoki at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, which became a big-time belt in Japan, which it remains to this day. Nitro girls are expected to be back on the October 11th Nitro.
They were pulled for internal disagreements, largely heat with Kimberly. At one point it appeared they would bring in a whole new crew, but instead it looks now like Kimberly will be off the team, they'll get a new director, and she'll be used as Paige's manager.
All bets may be off, but there was talk of bringing Savage back to feud with Luger so the women would have a feud. Chavo Guerrero Jr. is out of action with a concussion. There's talk of doing television from Europe in February when WCW tours there. There's been talk of that many times in the past, but they always change their minds beforehand. In Bret Hart's Calgary Sun column this week, he paid tribute to longtime Stampede Wrestling announcer Ed Whalen, who retired from broadcasting this past week.
Whalen was a legendary pro wrestling announcer in Calgary, although God only knows why, because I don't think I ever saw an announcer so effectively kill heel heat in my life.
Hart ripped on Bulldog again as well, ripping on him for fighting women and saying he doesn't approve of anyone who says they are doing anything to honor his brother when they stand to gain from it financially or through publicity. Smith, originally in the local newspaper, talked about returning to the WWF and dedicating his career to Owen, but when they were still speaking, Bret talked Smith out of it and he never mentioned Owen on WWF television, although there were apparently controversial comments made regarding Bret on the first WWF interview, which, as it turned out, never aired on television. Another name who hasn't gotten much pub that was just added to the booking committee was Bob Mould. He's a writer in the music industry who is a longtime wrestling fan, and said to be in particular a New Japan fan, and people were saying he was becoming an influential force, which may explain why there were competitive matches and clean, at least by US standards, finishes up and down Nitro this week. For September 24th in the UK, Nitro beat Raw by a 310,000 to 280,000 viewer margin, while worldwide on the network drew 860,000 viewers. WWF.
As for Bob Marella, Gorilla Monsoon, the last reports we have is that he was resting comfortably in recent days, but his condition is still considered grave.
For the October 17th pay-per-view announced thus far is Triple H vs. Austin for the title, Rock vs. Bulldog, a Four Corners match with X-Pac, Kane, Farouk, and Bradshaw, Jarrett vs. China in a Good Housekeeping match. I'd guess that's loser wears a dress or an apron, but not sure yet, for the IC title, and Ivory vs. Moolah for the women's title. Latest on Shamrock is that his neck injury won't require surgery, although there is significant damage done. At this point it doesn't look like he'll be returning to pro wrestling, and is concentrating on managing and training his Lion's Den fighting team and getting back into the fighting in 2000. For Raw on October 4th at the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey, before a sellout 14,611, paying $380,406, it opened with a three-way with Acolytes winning over Hollies, Outlaws and X-Pac and Kane. Hollies and Outlaws were both counted out, leading one to believe they'll be facing each other for the titles either on TV or pay-per-view soon. X-Pac refused to tag Kane, and it wound up with a double pin, with Bradshaw pinning X-Pac after a clothesline while Kane pinned Farouk after a choke slam. The ref ruled X-Pac and Bradshaw as the legal men in. Bulldog actually cut a real good heel promo. China came out and challenged him to a match. Mankind went to Rock and broke up their team. Rock was on the phone and paying no attention. The way it was scripted was pretty funny. Stephanie had amnesia from getting the head blow in England, so I guess she's not marrying Test. I sure liked the idea that Test would fool around with Terry Runnels the night before the wedding a lot more than the amnesia gimmick. Moolah and Mae Young tore Ivory's top off in our requisite seeing the black bra of a WWF woman spot. Terry Runnels came out for the Christian and Edge vs. Hardy Boys match. She still can't talk. You can see her ribs in her half top, which is, unfortunately, a telltale sign of an eating problem. These women with the exaggerated looks past 30, no fat on their legs and huge boobs, are probably doing more damage to themselves than the guys who fill themselves with steroids. Edge pinned Jeff Hardy after a spear. That wasn't perfectly timed. Really good work, but this got no heat. Triple H did an interview. Austin was shown doing a taped interview since he wasn't there. Triple H ended up clotheslining Jim Ross out of his chair when Ross insulted him. He punted him all over the ring.
Moolah and Mae Young beat Miss Kitty and Ivory when Moolah pinned Kitty with a schoolgirl, except that's probably the worst term for it.
How about she pinned her with a nursing home special?
Jarrett put the figure 4 on Kitty after the match, but Mae Young made the save. Droz threw up in Brown's gym bag, so figure on adding that one to the pay-per-view.
Mankind came out with the 2 stars of G vs. E. They promoted the hell out of the show for October 10th, in which Mankind stars as himself. Mankind talked about he and Rock as one of those legendary tag teams like the Funks and Briscoes and Skip and Zip that are no more.
Jericho came out and insulted Rock.
Rock talked about how Jericho is some guy who used to beat up a jabroni named Juventud down south. Lawler and Michael Cole pretended to have no idea who Juventud was or what Rock was talking about. Backstage, Dudleys attacked Mankind and Richards. Woe was doing dude love.
They had a match which the Dudleys won with 3D on Richards in 2:42.
Mankind was occupied by Val Venus. Vince did an interview and challenged Smith to fight him. Smith just walked off.
Now they've got the lead heels in the promotion backing down from physical confrontations with Vince. Can't wait for Hogan to come back for their dream match, and Vince will make the Superman comeback on Hogan.
Rock pinned Jericho in the main event in 7:43 with the People's Elbow.
Rock got out of Jericho's finisher and kicked out of outside interference spots by Who's.
Jericho is really coming across as far as how he's portrayed in the ring as a mid-carder. After the match, Bulldog ran in. Vince threw Bulldog into the ring and Rock gave him a low blow. For SmackDown on September 30th, Jericho beat Dog via DQ when Dog threw down Earl Hebner. The Hollies power-bombed Dog through a table after the match. Mankind did a comedy skit saying he wanted what was in Venus' pants, Rocco the Socko, and made a bunch of double entendre jokes right out of Three's Company in the 70s. Venus said his putter doesn't swing from that side of the green, and Mankind said that he had no idea what he was talking about. In the first of the best of 5 for $100,000 in play money and the rights to have Terry Runnels as manager, Edge and Christian beat Hardy Boys with a great finish of Christian suplexing Jeff Hardy off the top rope while sitting on Edge's shoulders. Brown no contest show for the European title when Droz and Albert attacked Brown and Show respectively. Henry saved Brown, then went on TV crying, saying he had a problem and that he was a sex addict and needed professional help.
Rock told Mankind to get the sock from Venus.
Mankind confronted Bubba Ray Dudley, who was wearing a Rock and Sock Connection ring jacket which Bubba said he found in a garbage can.
X-Pac and Kane won a 3-way over Acolytes and Dudleys. In a match that didn't air on television, Sumo Solo Fatu returned with a new gimmick, pinning Crash Holly.
What they need with Fatu at this point is beyond me.
Don't they already have a bunch of 330-pound guys who move slow, have no charisma, and can't get any heat?
Blackman beat up Jim Dotson. A whole group of women, including Cindy Margolis, Heather Coatsart, of Shasta McNasty, the show which debuted after Raw, Chyna, Moolah, Mae Young, Deborah, Lillian Garcia, the Makeup Girl, and everyone else all attacked Jarrett. Mankind no contest Dudley when Richards ran in as Dude Love. Venus ran in, but Mankind put him in the groin claw.
Dudley saved and ripped up the jacket. Main event was Triple H no contest Bulldog for the title with Rock as ref.
Wound up with Austin showing up brawling with Austin while Rock brawled with Bulldog. A correction from last week. Kimona has not signed. She was being considered, but no contract has yet to be offered, and there is internal debate about whether to take her or not. It appears Shawn Michaels has no problem about going to FMW for the November 23rd Yokohama Arena show, as he sees it as a chance to make Japanese connections to where he can book the talent he's training overseas.
Rock and Big Show did a public appearance in Oxford, England that drew 10,000 people. WWF officials told Taz they want him to do and play the same character he played in ECW. How's this for a funny one?
Nicole Bass, who currently has a $120 million lawsuit outstanding against the WWF for treating her as a sex object, will be working October 30th in Long Island as part of an oil wrestling troupe. People magazine is considering Rock for one of its Sexist Men of the Year lists. SmackDown taping on September 28th in Richmond, Virginia drew a sellout 8,791, paying $247,443.
Lisa is planning on doing a show on pro wrestling and its effect on kids on October 12th.
MSNBC is doing a Headliners and Legends show devoted to Vince McMahon on October 13th, which airs at 10 p.m. Eastern.
Somehow I think it'll fall into the realm of heavy fiction, but we'll see.
Apparently Steve Sharp, a 280-pounder who works indies around St. Louis and Arkansas, has signed a developmental deal, as has Joe Hitchin, Joe E. Legend, out of Toronto, who was the first tag team partner of Adam Copeland, Edge, before Jay Russo. Wall Street Journal ran a story about the WWF IPO but really didn't say much about it, other than compare it with Martha Stewart Living, which is also going public. Chaos. Comics will be doing a 4-issue Steve Austin comic book starting next month. On this week's Billboard video charts, WWF has the top 5 places on the charts, with Rock ahead of Austin for the number 1 spot.
They have 11 of the top 20 sports videos, while WCW has 4, Hogan, Flair, Mayhem and Piper, and Wrestling with Shadows remains on the charts at number 18.
The Reader's Pages. Hall of Fame. When the next round of Hall of Fame balloting comes around, I'd like to see, be it a separate category, wrestling media honored, and for 2 of wrestling's greatest magazine photographers, Tony Lanza and Gene Gordon, considered.
Wrestling magazines have been an important part as a link to fans.
In the 1950s-70s, nearly every top name in the Mid-Atlantic region had their studio, posed and action shots caught on film by Gordon.
Gordon's grappling gems appeared in the Fax publications, Wrestling Monthly and Wrestling Review, and Lanza, former wrestler out of Montreal, had his work appearing in virtually every newsstand publication, not to mention arena programs. Long before newsletters were taking fan clubs to the next level, a very important level I feel, Ring Wrestling, Wrestling World, Wrestling News, Stan Weston's publications The Wrestler and Inside Wrestling, were very important to fans to see what was going on in other promotions in other parts of the country. Gordon and Lanza were pioneers in capturing on film some of the sport's greatest moments. Now it's time for the wrestling public to recognize their invaluable contributions. Don Label. In New York. Readers' Letters. When reading some of the insightful, thoughtful, intense, completely passionate, honest and thought-provoking letters in the Reader's Pages, I sometimes think to myself, hey guys, this is pro wrestling, you know, with the Bruiser and the Crusher training with beer kegs and handsome Jimmy Valiant beating up Pepper Gomez.
Not the real world.
I don't want pro wrestling to be the real world.
John Boss. Streamwood, Illinois.
Response from Dave Meltzer. Depending upon the subject matter, letters can range from trivial topics such as minor aspects of a soap opera script to compliments and complaints regarding 9-figure per year very real businesses, no different from letters to sports pages on the state of those industries, and pro wrestling as an industry is every bit as real as any sport.
To the most real topics of all, drug abuse and even death. Bruiser and Crusher haven't been in pro wrestling in more than a decade, and accept that they are part of this industry's history and in some way shaped it in parts of the country. What they did back then and what wrestling was back then has very little to do with the industry today. We may not want pro wrestling to be part of the real world or for any aspect of it to be serious, but when young kids are growing up without a father, it doesn't get much more real or serious. ECW. I would never impose my judgments on Paul Heyman and ECW. However, as they are about to embark on national exposure with TNN, there are a few things they could do. ECW is remarkably free of color.
While this works well on the southern-based TNN, with the Dudleys leaving, it would behoove ECW to sign up WWF/WCW washout 2 Cold Scorpio. Yes, his problems have been documented.
But when motivated, he's had great matches with Rob Van Dam, Sabu, and Taz.
Scorpio would be a good mid-card or semi-main event wrestler against Just Incredible, Lance Storm, and Jerry Lynn.
ECW has prided itself on strong tag teams. Without the Dudleys, what mainline duos exist?
John Kronus has been without a role since Perry Saturn left, and Paul Heyman has been looking for a gimmick for Skull Von Crush.
Why not put them together as the new Eliminators? An instant team with built-in merchandising. Finally, if he intends to use Jazz as a female wrestler as opposed to a valet, he should import female talent from Japan or Mexico for her to work with.
The matches should be worked out on the house cards before being put on TNN or pay-per-view. Both WWF and WCW claim to want to bring back women's wrestling, but neither company takes it seriously.
Perhaps ECW could take to ladies to a legit level, and not in leather dog collar matches. Jeffrey Cohen. Flushing, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer.
Scorpio has a lot to prove, as he hasn't looked good in more than a year.
Perhaps a strong All-Japan tour will change his rep.
Kronus and Von Crush as the Eliminators would be a disaster.
The original Eliminators were built up so huge and Saturn was the glue of the team.
A team fans see as second-rate. Calling themselves the Eliminators would be like in the 80s when Memphis tried the new Fabulous Ones, or when WWF tried the new Midnight Express. The original duo did work out fine when Stan Lane replaced Dennis Condrey, but that's because Bobby Eaton and Jim Cornette were the glue of the team.
I could be wrong, but I don't believe a woman versus woman serious match would get over with ECW fans over the long haul without sexual overtones thrown in. I wish I was wrong, but I wish I was wrong about a lot of things these days. Jazz clearly has great potential as a worker but is very inexperienced at doing a match. She can get by, and all it was in her pay-per-view match was getting by, doing the man versus woman contrast spots where the pussy guy sells and loses, but aside from that I don't see ECW fans wanting to see women in anything but 20 to 60 seconds catfights. To me, the only chance so-called serious women wrestling has of getting over in this country is like what happened during their peak periods in Japan, when the top women wrestlers are better than the men and, just as importantly, allowed to be. In the WWF, the JB Angels got over huge to the live crowds in the 80s because they were such spectacular workers doing a different style, but when they learned American style, nobody cared about them, and Medusa's matches really only got over in WWF against Bull Nakano on the nights Nakano was really on, and people didn't care about Alundra Blaze enough to where the division was basically killed with the Bertha Faye angle and then dropped, or they somehow find a link to the hard-to-tap teenage girl audience like the soccer team did this year, which in our culture would be next to impossible, and the audience that made All Japan Women in the 80s so huge. Hildebrand. I once got to hang out with Kerry Von Erich. I also got to hang around with Brian Pillman and Rick Rude. When each of them died, all I said was, "Say what? He's dead." That's Ed up. I've never met Brian Hildebrand. I don't think I've ever been within 50 feet of the man. But after reading your story about him in The Observer, I actually felt a lump in my throat. Really, that story, written from your point of view and from the point of view of his friends in the business, that really made me feel something? It wasn't so much that the story related to pro wrestling. It was a story about a happy, decent man who, just by virtue of being the type of person he was, made friends across all political barriers and touched the hearts of people who didn't even know him, simply from the word of mouth of his friends. Now, that's special. It was a story about a happy, decent man who got to work in a business he truly loved, and had a loving wife, and had many good friends who genuinely cared about him. It was a story about a man who was forced to suffer with terrible pain and a bleak eventuality, but still remain happy, decent, and optimistic. It was a story not so much concerned with the fact that he was a pro wrestling referee, but more about him as a man, who he was, how he lived life, and how he touched others, and eventually, how he faced his own death and how he will be remembered by those he touched. The stories told by you and his friends said it all. That's what touched me, and I never met the man. Scott Brooks. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Berlin. As for the idiotic Berlin character, if Germany hasn't had enough problems with neo-Nazis already, Alex Wright, out of desperation to have his career, is now preaching Germanism. Wright must be the worst European wrestler ever to work overseas. He was never over here, and can't hold a candle to the brilliance once possessed by his father Steve or Uncle Bernie. Robert Edelhauser. Vienna, Austria. Wrestlers and shoots. The world between reality fighting and pro wrestling is becoming more and more blurred. What pro wrestlers do you think would stand a chance in the octagon? I came up with a short list of American wrestlers, both past and present: Luthez, Karl Gotch, Danny Hodge, Rick, and Scott Steiner, Taz, Harley Race, and possibly Bruno Sammartino and Scott Norton, based purely on power. Also, in the modern era, what pro wrestling matches were shoot or semi-shoots? Two matches that come to mind are Dick the Bruiser versus Alex Karras and Dory Funk Jr. versus Lord Al Hayes. Hayes pinned Funk Jr. in your listing on the big stars of the different decades. In the 60s, wouldn't Dick the Bruiser, The Sheik, Johnny Valentine and Fritz von Erich have been bigger stars than Ray Stevens? Tributes was great reading. Some suggestions for future books: promoters and territories, Japan. Great angles, champions that never got the belts, and YN wrestlers who weren't given enough credit, like Luis Martinez, Angelo Poffo, and Lars Anderson. Larry Floyd. St. Louis, Missouri. Response from Dave Meltzer. Being in the octagon is like training for any sport. What pro wrestlers would do well in the NFL? The ones that have experience playing football. What pro wrestlers would do well in the NBA? The ones who were good college players, which is none of them, but you get the idea. The guys who have trained for it, like Ken Shamrock, Tsuyoshi Kosaka and Dan Severn, would do well and have done well. Kurt Angle, being that he's an Olympic gold medal winning wrestler, if he trained for it, certainly has the basics in wrestling, and that if he was open-minded about learning new things and went for it, he'd probably do fairly well, although Olympic gold medalists have lost to submission fighters before. As for the names you mentioned, Luthez and even more Karl Gotch certainly had reputations among the wrestlers as if they could do it, but we've also learned untested reputations often get exposed in the octagon. Thez did boxing training and knew his submissions and had amazing reflexes.
Wrestling legend usually lists those two along with Billy Robinson as being some of the toughest, and Gotch supposedly did prove it in Europe before coming to the US, but again it was a different world.
People who should know rate them very highly. Tim Woods used to take on all-comers and was an NCAA champion, and you'd have to be very tough to take on all-comers. One guy bit his finger off in the process of one of those kind of fights.
If Danny Hodge had trained for it, within his weight division because his competition wrestling weight was 175 pounds, my feeling is he'd have been just about unbeatable, although unbeatable also doesn't exist in the true shoot world because of the differences of styles, but it's hard for me to imagine anyone of his size being able to compete with his absolutely freakish strength, which would enable him to be able to use just normal moves and make them unorthodox submission moves.
Wrestling skill and boxing ability. The Steiners are really tough guys among pro wrestlers.
There are also amateur wrestlers that would blow the Steiners out of the water that haven't done a thing in MMA. I don't know how much formal stand-up training or formal submission training they have.
Their wrestling would probably be enough to beat some lower-ranked people that have been in UFC, but against the top-caliber people they'd have to be considered a question mark at this point. The Steiners might also be injury-prone in that environment. Taz's ability as a top-level shooter is a Paul Heyman creation. Again, I'm sure he's a tough guy compared to a guy on the street, but it isn't like he was ever an NCAA champion wrestler, and he has very limited if any actual training in kickboxing. Harley Race was considered a tough street fighter, but he'd be out of his league in the octagon against a real fighter as he never trained in it. Anything I write about Bruno Sammartino is going to get his fans upset, but again, he was a very strong man, but strength alone can't beat an elite fighter without the fighting skill.
Sammartino did a little boxing and even more wrestling before getting into pro wrestling, but was never world-class at either.
Norton is exceedingly strong, actually scary strong. He had a street fighter reputation growing up in Minneapolis.
While street fights aren't always fair, he was also knocked out in 3 punches by Tony Halme in Japan in a bar, which depending on the situation that it happened in may or may not even be relevant to this discussion, and granted, Robinson has been beaten up in bars before as well, and Peter Maivia pulled his eye out in a street fight, and that isn't relevant to this either. But Halme only lasted 1 minute with Randy Couture in UFC, and Couture only lasted 90 seconds with Enson Inoue.
As far as modern era matches that were shoots or semi-shoots, the ones I can come up with were Mildred Burke vs. Joyce Grable, shoot; Andre the Giant vs. Akira Maeda, almost a shoot; Maeda vs. Satoru Sayama, ended up as one; Muhammad Ali vs. Antonio Inoki, actual shoot; Rikitozen vs. Masahiko Kimura.
Rikitozen in the middle of the match suddenly went at it for real and got the jump on Kimura and hurt him. Inoki vs. a guy from India or Pakistan; Shinya Hashimoto vs. Naoya Ogawa, semi-shoot; and there have been several women's shoots, including one with Asia Kong vs. Medusa in a brutal kickboxing shoot, and many women's Vale Tudo and kickboxing rule shoots.
There have probably been others, but not as high profile. And actually have been many shoots in rings in Kingdom, a few in UWF and later UWFI, and the vast majority of matches in Pancrase, including just about all of them the past year or two.
I can't recall any true in-ring shoots in WWF or WCW in the modern era.
I think Bearcat Wright in Los Angeles pulled a double cross in a world title match against Fred Blassie on December 13, 1963. I don't know if it was a shoot per se, but Wright won a match he was supposed to lose, and I'd bet that sort of thing has happened numerous times over the years, but it's not like it was a shoot match. Karras vs. Bruiser's famous pro wrestling match in Detroit was not a shoot.
The incident a few nights earlier at the bar Karras owned was Bruiser trying to garner publicity for their match as an angle, but Bruiser apparently got out of control and Karras wasn't in on Bruiser's angle, although he figured it out right away, but then Bruiser wouldn't publicly calm down.
That turned into a real brawl with several arrests when it was over. Funk Jr. vs. Hayes was not a shoot. Stevens was probably about the same level of a national star as Bruiser, Sheik, Valentine, and Von Erich. When he died, I was told as a money earner, he was probably ahead of everyone but the NWA and WWF champion during his prime years.
I had him mention not that he was a bigger star than others mentioned, but because he was considered by nearly everyone as the best worker in the business in that era.
Jonathan Boyd. Regarding the passing of Lord Jonathan Boyd, maybe the most fondly remembered thing he ever did was in the heyday of the Kangaroos' feud with appliance dealer and show sponsor Tom Peterson. Peterson was doing a live commercial at the Portland Sports Arena and the Kangaroos locked him in a freezer. Maybe there should be a tiny corner in the Hall of Fame for the likes of Tom Peterson, who single-handedly kept Owen Promotions on television for so many years.
This area just hasn't been the same since Peterson fell on hard financial times.
Craig Thorne. Spanaway, Washington. Nitro Girls pay-per-view. I just finished watching the Nitro Girls pay-per-view. This was the worst piece of crap I've ever seen. That is no exaggeration.
I've seen terrible ideas in the last 15 years like the Herb Abrams UWF, Blow, the Ding Dongs, the Equalizer and on.
But this broke new ground for bad television. I can only assume what Eric Bischoff said when he had the idea. I want more skin.
I want lesbians. I want the Nitro Girls to discuss wrestling. I want table dancing. I want the Nitro Girls eating bananas. I want to see tattoos.
He got it, and boy did we get it.
We got to meet the Nitro Girls up close and personal.
At least two of these girls bear more than a passing resemblance to Nicole Bass. All appeared a little blemished and aged, and at least one was downright hideous looking.
Where was Ted DiBiase during all of this? I just hope he wasn't in the den with his family watching this, hoping for good Christian family entertainment.
If he was upset with the direction of the company before, he should be livid by now. This was smut.
It was pornography and it was degrading. That's not saying there is anything wrong with that, just don't lie to the people and claim your product is wholesome. What were the highlights?
I enjoyed the photographer and the producer discuss how great Ricoh cameras were. I loved the tease of nipple that never actually was shown. And the pool party scenes. In many ways, a comparison between this pay-per-view and the WWF Women's Division revealed the difference between the two companies.
The WWF's treatment of women is more original, softer and more subtle, like Playboy.
WCW women were presented much poorer, more seedier and less original, like Penthouse.
This was like watching a soft-core Penthouse video. Would I recommend this show?
Hell yeah. In many ways, this was better than bad. It was good. Like getting a tooth pulled or rubbernecking at a 5-car collision, this were morbid appeal to this show.
Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it did.
This set a new low standard for the wrestling industry, but I can't wait for the sequel. And my guess is this will do gangbuster numbers and there will be a sequel. Kent McCord. New York, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer. I can't tell you whether or not there will be a sequel, but can tell you this didn't do gangbuster numbers. McMahon.
A point nobody else has brought up yet on the Owen Hart tragedy is that my friend and I were astonished that Vince McMahon came back to ref the main event. When Pat Patterson began as ref, we thought he had taken the spot only to have Vince return for the scheduled finish. Was this really more important than spending time to contact the family? If this happened to someone working for you, would you just continue working or would you at least wait until the family was contacted?
Woody Barton.
Gloverville, South Carolina.
Response from Dave Meltzer. The original excuse for not announcing the death until 2 matches were left in the show was that the WWF wanted to contact all the family members before announcing it publicly, and Owen had a big family. As best I can tell, with the exception of Martha, who was contacted right away, nobody from the WWF contacted anyone in the family before the announcement was made. Stu wasn't contacted until midnight that night. Of course, the story has since changed many times since that point to where now nobody knew he was dead until there were 2 matches left in the show. As for why McMahon continued with his involvement in the angle, let's face it, you have to get your priorities straight when you're an actor on a live television show. Hart. With regard to the Owen Hart saga, for reasons I can't understand, the press, including yourself, has given Bret Hart a pass on his actions.
Hasn't he been exploiting the death of his brother to get back at Vince McMahon?
What does he hope to accomplish by ripping Davey Boy Smith in the newspaper every chance he gets?
Is Smith supposed to receive the blessing of Bret before he can go back to the WWF? What are Bret's motives?
You are the first to dissect every one of McMahon's moves, but you look the other way when Bret uses the death of his brother as a tool for his vendetta against the WWF.
I agree that nobody has come out of this smelling like a rose, but try to be fair and call it as you see it.
Brent Sekelarak. Round Lake Beach, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. Bret Hart's brother died and much of what happened in the aftermath was pretty disgusting when you look back at it. I totally disagree with the idea that Bret Hart has in any form exploited the death of his brother, and there were numerous publicity-gaining situations that he backed off of regarding that which continue to this day. The obvious pro wrestling angle that has been done in nearly every situation of this type would be to return and dedicate his comeback and winning the world title or something silly like this to his brother's memory. Hart has avoided doing the obvious angle, and don't think for a second it wasn't suggested to him because it's an obvious huge money angle. Smith wanted to go into WWF and do that exact angle, but Hart talked him out of it, and to his credit and their credit, he didn't do it either.
I agree that Hart should not have ripped Smith in the newspaper because it accomplished no purpose. There were a lot of underlying family problems ripped open in the period after Owen Hart died that may not heal for a long time, but served no purpose to vent on that subject in print.
It was actually meant as a joke, but in print it wasn't funny. McMahon has used the idea of Bret having a vendetta against the WWF far more as a way to deflect addressing the issues of his own personal behavior in the 2 weeks after the death and create the idea that the bad puppy he got for his own decisions has something to do with Bret Hart. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told.
Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities.
This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,